Well, good morning. Thank you for coming. This is room 112, and this is the valuation session. We're still waiting on a couple speakers to come, but we're just going to go ahead and get started. So our first speaker today is Graham Davis, and he's going to give a talk on the comparison sales approach to valuation, science or black magic. And again, welcome. My name's Marty Shumway, and I'm the session chair for this morning. I'm filling in for Tim Knobloch, who couldn't be here today. So we'll go ahead and get started. Graham?
Thank you. Well, welcome everyone to Colorado. If you're not from Colorado, you missed our Bahamas weather last week when it was t-shirts and shorts, and we made it nice and cold just so you'd remember us for what we're supposed to be is a nice winter haven here. I teach comp sales at the School of Mines. I also try to use it in some valuation practices, and I do expert witness work, and so I often have to appraise the practice of comp sales by other people. And it strikes me, or it's increasingly been striking me over the last few years that despite the fact that economics and finance and valuation involves a lot of science or science principles. In fact, economics of the social sciences is the most scientific discipline. Strikes me that there's a lack of science in the comparison sales approach. And I don't think there has to be a lack of science. I think we can still ask scientific questions and apply scientific principles to the approach. And what do I mean by science? Well, if valuation approaches are to be scientific, they need to have certain attributes. So assumptions about any model or any practice need to be clearly stated. This is true of any scientific process or activity. Any assumptions need to be based on theoretical foundations, in this particular case of finance or economics. We are doing a valuation. There is 200 plus years of theory on valuation in economics. And we had some major innovations in the 50s and 60s and again in the 80s in the theory of finance economics. So any assumptions need to recognize those and be based on those. Any assumptions you make, any model you build, has to be tested with empirical evidence. You cannot simply in science propose a model untested and say, here it is. This is the way the world works. Science involves testing with data, or at least testing with models and simulation. And science involves putting your model out there for others to criticize and experiment with and test. And if the evidence or the model doesn't support the assumptions, either your discovery of this or someone else's discovery of this, the assumptions need to be revised. And so science is an iterative process. If this process is not followed, the approach is what's called ad hoc or cookbook. Okay? Ad hoc or cookbook. So science tries to get rid of ad hoc methods or cookbook methods. So let's look at 4 of the assumptions embedded in current comparison sales practice. There are many assumptions. I'm just picked 4 because I only have 15 minutes. If I had an hour and a quarter, I could have done more. But here's 4 of the big ones. First of all, in comparison sales, the assumption is that identical properties have identical values. That is the assumption. That's the foundation of comp sales analysis. Another assumption that's often made is if property sizes are not equal, value is linear in property size. In other words, something that has twice the amount of gold will be twice the value of something that has of the target property. Okay? Value is linear in size. You may not realize that's an assumption of comp sales, but in practice, it turns out to be applied that way. Third assumption, value differences arising from difference in metals across properties can be adjusted for using metal equivalents. So if I have a gold and copper property that traded, and my target property is gold and silver, I can convert the copper into gold and the silver into gold and compare them on metal equivalents. There's an assumption that that's okay. There's an assumption that that's okay. It's done all the time. Metal equivalents done all the time. All right. Fourth assumption, outliers, when you collect your comp sales data, outliers, those that don't fit, broadly speaking, and I'll say more about that in a second, are bad data points, and they should be removed from the sample. The assumption is that those outliers are bad data points, and they should be removed. So I'm going to go through these one by one. First of all, identical properties have identical values. Let me try and move that little cursor out of the way there. Has this ever been tested? Yes. Millions of times by economists. It's called the law of one price. We've tested for international goods, for domestic goods, for assets. It holds. So the idea that identical properties have identical values, that one is done. You can tick it off. There's scientific evidence that that is true. Okay, now, of course, we never have identical properties in comp sales, but at least we have a foundation upon which to use the method. Now, if the properties are not identical, what do? We have to make adjustments. To make them identical, once they're identical, then they have the same value. That's the whole point of making the adjustments. Right? We're trying to get back to assumption number one. Right? So what about assumption number two? Value is linear in property size. And this is the algorithm that people use you may not realize that you're assuming this. Pointer out here. So what we do is we take the value of the sold property, divide it by the resource of the sold property. That gives us a value per ounce, or a value per ton, or a value per pound. And then we multiply it by the size of the target property, and that gives us the value of the target property. This is a common size adjustment in comp sales. It assumes, without explicitly saying so, I have not seen an appraiser yet say, I am assuming value is linear in size. You need to make that assumption if you use this equation. And the assumption is actually that there's a zero intercept. Value equals zero intercept, put a slope of b times q. Okay, so linear function. Assumes no economies or diseconomies of scale and size. That's what you're doing if you use a linear assumption. Here's an example of an appraisal I saw once, many years ago. The target property had about 5 billion pounds of copper, right here. And there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 comparison sales that this appraiser selected. One of them was Cerro Maimon down here. Very small trade value. The other one was Sustet, which was even smaller, right down near the origin. The other one was Barrio Seco right there, still smaller than our target property by about less than half. Then two big ones, Kansanshi, and El Pachon. Okay, and here's the values, and here's the sizes in terms of millions of pounds of contained copper, and here's the value. So we have 5 data points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The linear scale adjustment takes a slope through the origin and projects it up onto the size of the target asset. That's what we're doing when we make size adjustments. This is all buried in the ratios and nobody knows they're doing this, but this is actually what's going on. So Cerro Maimon was projected from a value of down 10 million to up to 240 million. That was the adjustment for size. I'm taking a $10 million sale and I'm going to adjust it up to $240 million to make it comparable. Imagine if somebody did that with a home appraisal. I'm going to take the garden shed next door, which I know they put in at $2,000. That's only 300 square feet, so I'm going to scale it up 100 times and appraise your house based on that. Right? But this is the size adjustment, the linear adjustment. Sustet, way down near the origin, was projected out to be 75 million. Kansanshi was brought back. El Pachon was brought back. Okay, so now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 values based on the size adjustment. Is this assumption of linearity reasonable? It's untestable because we just don't have enough data. Because properties are never only different in size. So it's an untestable proposition. It's okay, it doesn't rule it out from science. Makes it difficult to use if you have an untestable proposition. But at least we can model it. And so what I did is I said I gave an engineer a task. He's a design engineer for mining. I gave him a task. I said, can you calculate in a model value versus size for a copper asset? I want you to keep everything else the same. Just take the ore body and start expanding it and recalculate the value every time you expand it. So here's the starting size, and then it got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and the value you can see is certainly not linear, and it doesn't appear to go through the origin. So if I were to expand out this asset linearly, I would get something that goes out linearly from the origin like that, way off from the actual valuation as the asset expands. So my model at least tells me that the assumption of linearity fails. Okay. Other models could be tested too. This is just a preliminary model. What's happening here, by the way? Well, when I asked the engineer to do this, he didn't expand the asset by putting in multiple pits. He made the one asset bigger and bigger and bigger. So you have longer haul times, more truck needs as you get bigger and bigger. Right? You'd rather have 5 small pits than 1 pit 5 times the size, because at least with the small pits, you can stay close to service, don't have as much stripping. Everyone knows that. Okay. So the linearity here is a result of the design, or the non-linearity. Others may go up. So I would say that's a nail in the coffin preliminarily for value as linear in size. What about value differences arising from difference in metals? Okay, the assumption is the market price ratio of the metals is equal to the value ratio. That's one assumption. No differences by having byproduct versus co-product metals. Gold that comes along free is no different than copper that you have to separately extract. Okay, that's the assumption when you do metal equivalence. Right? No value effect from difference in recoveries or grades. These are all done in situ resource estimates. Right? So 100 ounce of high-grade gold plus 50,000 pounds of low-grade base metal that may never be recovered is equal to 110 ounces of high-grade gold equivalent based on the price ratios. Now, combined with a linear model, it assumes that the value of the base metal increases the value of the gold asset by 10%. Why? Because the gold amount went up by 10%, and then we add that to the linear model, means the copper increased the value by 10%. So there's a whole slew of assumptions in here in this metal equivalent stuff. Testable? No. None of these assumptions are testable. So again, we have a model that's not testable. But I looked at one feasibility study. It was kind of interesting to see. There was a primary metal with some co-product metals. And by doing the metal equivalent, it increased the primary metal size by 30%, therefore increased the value of the asset by 30%. So you had the primary metal and you got all this other stuff. We just metal equivalent into the primary metal, and it made the primary metal 30% bigger. Okay, so therefore the value from that extra stuff was plus 30%. The feasibility study actually did 2 designs, one with only the primary metal and one with all the other metals extracted as well. Comes out with 100% more value when you extract all the other metals compared to just the primary metal. So how close is our assumption that these extra, or these assumptions, 1, 2, 3, 4 of them, how close does that get us to what the model shows? Not very close. The model shows these extra metals are worth 100%. Our assumptions show the extra metals worth 30%. Now, I'm not really sure that the feasibility study DCF is a valuation model, so I'll put a caveat there. This is just preliminary, but there is some evidence that our assumptions fail on the metal equivalent analysis. Outliers are bad data points and should be removed. Okay? Tests of this assumption, for the most part, none. That's strange because there's many statistical tests that can test for outliers. Cook's distance, for example. Outliers are most likely valid and highly influential data points. They should not be removed, just be removed because they're influential or they don't fit the model. Typically, when you have outliers, it signals something. It signals your model is no good. The problem is with your model, not with the data. That's what statisticians say about outliers. Okay. Just going back to the example here, these 3 data points here, when you scale up Burial Seco, Kansanshi, and El Pachon, you get a nice little cluster of values for your target property. And then these 2 here, oh, they're way out. So we'll just eliminate those because they're outliers. Well, first of all, I can tell you any statistical test of 5 data points will not rule out 2 as outliers. Right? Outliers are when you have 1,000 data points and 1 sticks out way out there. If you have 5 data points, all 5 data points are data. And what do the data tell us? The data tell us that probably value is not linear in size. That's what the data is telling us. Our model is wrong. Our model looks pretty good, though, if you throw these 2 out. And so what we tend to do is we throw out data to validate the model, rather than using the data to test the validity of the model. We assume the model is right and we throw out the data. That is not a scientific process. The data is used to test the model. The model is not presumed right in advance. So comparison sales as practiced at the moment, to me, as a practicing academic, and I'm probably a little more on the science is important side than most people, our work is subject to severe peer review regularly, and we just get used to this idea of presenting assumptions and validating models. That's the whole practice of academics, I would say. And the practice of comparison sales, as done currently, seems to be more like ritualistic magic than science. Assumptions are not questioned. Methods are not questioned. Ratios are just taken and multiplied, and the numbers we get, and then we throw out the numbers we don't like. And it's really not scientific at all right? So assumptions have to be questioned. They have to be made clear, and they have to be tested. And if you have contradictory evidence, as I would suggest we have for 3 of the 4 assumptions that I showed you at the beginning, then we have to rethink what we're doing. And perhaps, until we rethink it, the comparison sales approach should be abandoned, because it's not a science-based approach. And we're not doing ourselves as appraisers or valuers any favors by using non-science-based approaches, because it's just not credible. It's just not credible. A guy named Paul Sabatier at the University of California, Davis said it nicely. The critical characteristics of science are that both the methods and the concepts should be self-consciously subjected to criticism and evaluation by experts in that field. I think we need more of this. I think we need more self-conscious criticism and evaluation of the methods we use in order for it to move from being ritualistic magic to being science-based. Thank you. That's my pitch. Bye-bye.